And welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Doody, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune into Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I will introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. We want Higher Ed Live to become your go-to professional development resource. To improve the quality and delivery of our content, help us by filling out the survey at the link that we're tweeting out shortly. This broadcast is sponsored by ACPA, College Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover additional personal and professional development opportunities. I also want to take a moment to thank Robin Janice and Kate Zulo, who are helping to monitor the back channel and will be forwarding to me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. Finally, I am very honored to have join us today Zaneta Rago-Craft, Yoshiko Harden, and Lena Tenney. I'd like to start off by having you each briefly introduce yourself, your current role, and why this topic is important to you. Let's start off with you, Lena.
Excellent. Hello, my name is Lena Tenny, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am a researcher and facilitation specialist at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. We're an engaged interdisciplinary research institute housed at The Ohio State University. All of our work is intended to be with and for communities challenging race and racism to build a more just and equitable society. So a lot of what my day-to-day looks like is traveling the country to do workshops and presentations and keynotes about the topic of implicit bias within the context of things like structural racism. And how we combat these sorts of issues. And then I also do research when I have time, which means never, but I do a little bit of research. Right now I'm focusing on bathroom bills and the way that they are actually grounded in anti-Blackness and racism. So be looking for that piece in a couple months probably. But that is the short version of what I do. And this topic is really important to me because we talk a lot about dismantling systems of oppression, and that is incredibly important. And we can't do that dismantling work if we are not also committed to doing the everyday in the trenches work of challenging bias during interpersonal conversations when it emerges. So these topics around inclusive language and implicit bias are really important to me as an element of how we progress or how we form a society that is more equitable for everyone to be able to be affirmed as who they are and their value as a human being.
Great.
Great, thank you. Yoshiko?
Yeah, so hi, thank you for the invitation to participate this morning. I'm on the West Coast, my time. So I'm Yoshiko Harden, and I'm currently the Vice President for Student Services at Seattle Central College, which is in Washington State. And we're one of 34 community technical college systems. So in my area, it's kind of all those student supports, student engagement, clubs and organizations that I oversee. And this work is really important to me because for the first 15 years of my career, I was only in multicultural and equity work, coming up kind of through advising, multicultural services. And then my last job was as Vice President of Diversity and CDO at another local community college. And also, I'm at the dissertation stage of my research, which is on racial microaggressions in African-American males in community college. So it's kind of personal, professional, all of that. And I think early on in my career, listening to students talk about their experiences in the classroom or around campus, it wasn't necessarily the kind of the overt acts that they experienced, but that underlying kind of pervasiveness that we're going to talk a little bit about today. So thank you again.
Excellent, great. Zaneta.
Howdy, everyone. My name is Zaneta Rago-Craft. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm the director at the Center for Social Justice Education in LGBT Communities, actually at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And our role essentially, we have a plural role. We act as an LGBTQA resource center on campus, in addition to coordinating and facilitating a lot of the co-curricular diversity and inclusion curriculum. Primarily that happens outside of the classroom, but we have also gone into classrooms as well. The reason this topic is important to me professionally is because we're one of the most diverse institutions in the country, but diversity and inclusion are two different things. And I think it's really important for me in my professional work to help everyone, right? So students, faculty, staff, community members understand that inclusion is actually everyone's work, right? And everyone's responsibility. So I think that's why implicit bias is so important, because it is so pervasive. And personally, as a complex student myself who had trouble, navigating and being a whole person in my institution as an undergraduate, I think it's important to help facilitate and encourage spaces where students can bring their whole selves and really live in their truths as they navigate, because ultimately that will lead to their success, right? So personally and professionally, those are why it's important.
Great, thank you. Zaneta, can you keep us going and help set the foundation for our conversation today? I'm going to start off by talking about implicit bias, and then we'll move on to talking about inclusive language in the second half of the episode. But can you start us off by defining implicit bias and perhaps provide a few examples?
Sure. So, a really short and succinct definition of implicit bias. It refers to the deeply rooted attitudes, beliefs, or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions, and behaviors, often in an unconscious manner. And I think some everyday examples include assuming someone's gender identity or pronouns based on the way they're presenting, or the assumption that of someone's racial identity and then the associated experiences. So for a more specific example, as someone who's often read as Latina, I often get asked if English is my first language, or folks will come up to me and just immediately speak Spanish, or assume that I'm a first-generation immigrant to the country. And while neither of those experiences are inherently negative, their unconscious assumption based on perceived race is negative, especially if they occur frequently.
So in doing research for this episode, I came upon a faculty member at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Patricia Devine, who suggested that the term implicit bias has quote, become so broad that it almost has no meaning. And she suggests instead that the term unintentional bias would be more appropriate. Now, Lena, I know that I shared some of these questions beforehand, and you had some thoughts on this particular question.
Yes, I appreciate Dr. Devine bringing up that point, because it is true that this term has become very broad and all-encompassing, particularly as it has become more popularized and has entered the public discourse. So, for example, this past election cycle was the first time that implicit bias was mentioned in a presidential debate. So we see it on this national stage. And I think it is reminiscent of a very common happening amongst academic research, which is implicit bias originated largely in psychology, social psychology research. So as terms exit the ivory tower and become more popularized, they can sometimes lose precision in the process. So an example of that right now, I think, is intersectionality, how Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality is incredibly deep and meaningful, and it should be popularized, and at the same time in the process is often watered down and doesn't do due diligence to the thought that she put into it, right? A lot of the time it gets misrepresented at this point. So I think implicit bias can be in that same pattern right now. And I think that regardless of whether we call it implicit bias or unintentional bias, what we need to be doing is making sure we're defining precisely what we're talking about when we have these conversations. thoughts I have around implicit and unintentional. So the reason it's called implicit bias is because it's implicit social cognition. So it's unknown to ourselves. However, the effects of implicit bias are very explicit to the people that they negatively affect when we perpetuate things like microaggressions as a result of our own implicit or unconscious biases, right? So I want to acknowledge that whether we call it implicit or unintentional, we still need to be focusing on the fact that those words describe how our biases appear to ourselves and do self-reflection, and not use it to shift blame away from ourselves when we perpetuate harmful acts, even if they are unintentional, because we live in a society where the common narrative is that things like racism, for example, are only negative interpersonal interactions where one person is quote unquote a racist. And we don't often talk about things like implicit bias and structural racism as part of these contextualizing factors and the things that are happening all the time. So if I can give a really brief example that I use a lot of the time when I facilitate these types of learning sessions for folks. So let's say everyone that's tuned in is holding a really nice glass vase, like the type of maybe crystal or glass that your grandma has in that cabinet in the house that no one actually uses those dishes. They're just for show, right? So this really valuable thing that we're holding. And let's say half of us are washing the vase and we're dancing in the process because we're listening to music and your jam comes on, you get a little bit distracted. And in that moment, this slippery vase you're washing falls to the ground. So the vase is broken now, right? So let's say the other half of us are paying very close attention when we're washing the vase, but we get really upset because we remember we had a really difficult day at work, and in a fit of anger, we take that vase and we smash it on the ground. That vase is identically so broken and has been forever altered by that experience. So the common narrative around things like implicit bias and racism and all forms of oppression is that it has to require intentionality. And that's just not the case if we're focusing on the experience of the vase. Of course, the vase being our object lesson for people's lives and experiences. So we're at the Kerwin Institute, we're trying to flip the narrative so that instead of looking for evidence of intentionality behind things like microaggression, bias, and discrimination, instead we're focusing on the experiences of the people who encounter those on an all too frequent basis and are making sure that we are repairing that vase, acknowledging that we had a negative effect on it instead of defending our own selves as good people who didn't mean to do harm because the harm has happened. So let's address it instead of backpedaling about whether we meant to do it or not.
Wow, great. Thank you. And I love the metaphor. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Yoshiko, we're going to go to you next. I'm going to ask if you can help us understand where, when, and how we learn or inherit our implicit bias or our bias.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's in kind of the air we breathe, right? So family of origin are how biases can be shaped. Also, what's circulating in media or popular culture, and then what's absent from media or popular culture can shape our biases. Clearly, kind of the institutional components, so socialization and through education or military, criminal justice system, healthcare. So it's kind of everywhere we are, and when we engage with other people. So it could be your religious affiliation or spiritual beliefs might shape your views on the world or certain people, certain populations. And I wanted to add to a point around intention, because we do get caught up in intention, and kind of the assumption around race and racism is that it's only bad intentioned people, right, that commit bad acts. And when what's really happening the majority of the time is well-intentioned, what we call well-intentioned, ill-equipped, right? So well-meaning, but kind of the same harmful effects. And Paul Gorski has a great piece called Good Intentions Aren't Enough, really trying to shift to not so much focus on people's intent, but as Lena was mentioning, kind of the impacts. And I think that's a really important shift.
So again, as I researched this, I found that age played a part in bias. And I have 3 children that are between the ages of 5 and 10, and I feel like they're incredibly impressionable and vulnerable to, they're observing everything. They're observing how I react, they're observing how their teachers and other folks react. Is there a particular age where we really start to solidify our bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as early as baby or as 1 year old. So one of the things that, and I think children are a good example because children don't necessarily develop their bias until they're corrected, right? Most often by an adult. So, and we do that well, and a child might go and pick up a snake, right? And then they're corrected, and then that's part of how they learn. Or as a little kid of color, I didn't learn that I was Black or different until I had negative experiences on the playground, right? Where I was called the N-word. And then that was what shaped like, oh, okay, I stand out. So it can be around, I thought I was just like everybody else until someone told me that I wasn't. So children are a really good example watching them because then we correct them. So a child might say, why is that person like that? And then a parent might say, shh, 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 don't, that's impolite. And so then it's like, we don't talk about people we think are like that. And also we don't do it in public.
Great. So you mentioned the role that news plays. How about pop culture and in particular social media? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, go ahead. One of the speakers, go ahead.
I would just say, I think we can talk for hours and hours about media. So I think for me, social media needs to be in its sort of own category because there are definitely positives about social media, especially when it comes to things like organizing or consciousness raising. But there are still very dark sides to social media and social networking. For one, anonymity or the pretense of anonymity brings out some of the most hideous and abusive behaviors, as I'm sure we have all experienced. And in addition, even for folks that are known to us, right, our social networks often operate as an echo chamber of our own beliefs, particularly where our friends become more and more like ourselves. And I think there's two sides to that. So I'm not going to pass any blame on folks who delete people for survival, right? So if you have, folks in your friends list who are just trolling you, there's no judgment on that, particularly if they're trolling about an identity that is your own identity. But I like to challenge folks who don't necessarily have that, particularly target identity, who delete people because they disagree with them. I actually think coming from a position of power, privilege, depending on what's being spoken about in the social media, is that you actually shouldn't delete them as part of active allyship, and to actually expose that person to views that are different and allyship, because then folks who are marginalized don't necessarily have to do that constant labor of explaining their own narratives. People should have the space to do that, but they shouldn't always be expected to do that for the benefit of others. So I think social media is like a weird place that has both good and bad components to it. We just have to know how to use it and truly embrace and engage it.
Yoshiko, did you have some other thoughts on it?
So I'm the parent of a 16-year-old daughter who is very invested in social media. And one of the things I talk to her about is kind of ignorance is bliss. So when I was her age, my world was actually pretty small. So I didn't know about things that happened right away. It didn't show up on my phone. I didn't have a phone. So it was kind of my neighborhood around the 10 blocks. And her experience is much different. She finds out about events or things that happen. So she had an experience where she went to a birthday party with all of her friends and then learned, like, over the weekend, another set of friends had burned a Black Lives Matter poster, and my daughter's Black. And so she saw it on Snapchat. So it was like navigating that type of environment. So she wasn't there, but she saw the event, and it had an impact, even though she wasn't there. So I think it's really complicated, and especially as a parent, since I'm not as skilled as she is, she knows I don't know as much as she knows about how to use media or social media. And, there's we see in higher ed around stalking, anxiety, depression, kind of the inclusion, exclusion, and then how are we as an institution, should we be responding to Facebook posts that happen when students are not in class, kind of that whole terrain.
Yeah, it's really, really a lot of uncharted territories on
Yes.
how we go about our practice. Lena, do you have something to say, Lena?
I was going to ask if I could add something to that.
Yeah, of course.
So speaking to media, the literature on implicit bias indicates that the two biggest formulators of our implicit associations are early childhood experiences with friends, family, school, etc., and media, both traditional and social. And the reason for that is because implicit bias relies upon what's called associative memory, which very simply, that's the fancy phrase for the fact that as human beings, we pair things together in our mind, right? So if I put the Starbucks logo up on this live stream, what's the first thing that you would think of? Probably coffee. That's an implicit association. Implicit associations rely very, very heavily upon repeated exposure. That's why media is such a big formulator of our implicit associations, because media is all about repeated exposure. It's all about ads. It's all about whose lives are portrayed on the big screen and in which ways, who is consistently typecasted, who is the hero or heroine of their own story versus someone who's just part of the story, who are the villains. All of these things from a very early age become internalized messages. And media is actually one of the reasons why we can have implicit associations that do not favor our own identities, right? It's actually pretty common for this to happen for folks. Implicit biases are not necessarily self-interested. They're more a reflection of what messages we've received cumulatively over a lifetime, right? So I say all of this to say that this is part of why it's so important to think about media, and how media is a really good example of how these cognitive and interpersonal barriers that happen in regards to oppression are very strongly linked to the systemic forms of oppression that are happening, because who has access to Hollywood and whose stories are portrayed are systemic issues that reinforce cognitive biases that then reinforce systemic issues. So our challenge is to interrupt that never-ending cycle when and where we're able to do so. And that includes in virtual spaces, because I think a lot of the time virtual spaces like Facebook and Twitter are dismissed as not real. And that's just not the case. So virtual spaces and places are still spaces and places, and words on the internet are still words that impact people's experiences, identities, and lives. So particularly as student affairs professionals, I think we actually have an obligation to be aware of things like social media, examples of how things that we don't see personally as a witness can still impact us as things come across our timeline and whatnot. So I think we do have a responsibility to intervene when bias manifests, whether it's an in-person interaction or on the interwebs, as it were. And harkening back to what both folks have said here, a lot of that has to do with taking stock of our own identities and the ways in which we can leverage our privileged axes of identities to speak up and intervene in those moments, especially if they're online, because then we actually have maybe some additional time to think and parse our words and be intentional about what we want to say in that moment.
Lena, you talked earlier about being self-reflective, and in the spirit of us all being a work in progress, would each of you be willing to share a time or story when you discovered yourself or caught yourself confronting your own implicit bias?
Sure.
Zaneta, you want to go first?
Sure. So when I first started at Rutgers, my center was working with, at the time, a small group of active trans and non-binary students. And we would hold these monthly dinners to build camaraderie among the students, but then also to engage them in dialogue about what was going on campus and what their experiences were like. So something that was really common that came up was the issue of restrooms. And now, for our non-discrimination policy on campus, it protects students to use restrooms based on their gender identity and or expression. So, you know, knowing which bathrooms you had the right to use, right, wasn't necessarily the case. But it was more so having access to single-use restrooms that were all gender encompassing. And you know, honestly, on a campus as Rutgers, I hope you know that we are large and complex is the easiest way that I can say that. It was sometimes difficult, right, to find locations, to know where, you know, what floor single-use restrooms were. And in that moment, I realized that I did not actively think about where the closest single-use restroom was to my center when I was programming on campus or as I was navigating the campus. And that was a place of privilege, right? You know, I may be a queer person, but I am not a trans or non-binary person. I'm cisgender. And so that was a real moment where I had to, you know, use my sort of student affairs cap and also, you know, recognize my privilege of not having to think about this to be proactive, right? And to work with the students to find a solution. So, you know, what we did was, I'm also a bit of a techie, so we actually Google mapped every single-use restroom on campus. There's over 100 of them. But me and a handful of students went through and did that down to the door label. And, you know, I think implicit bias still comes up and explicit bias still comes up when I talk about sort of changing the restroom signs that are on the single-use restrooms on campus, because some of them are still gender specific for coding purposes. But, you know, ultimately, it might not be a second thought to most cis folks, to really any cis folks, but it is absolutely vital to our trans and non-binary students' experience here and their safety, quite frankly.
Great. Anyone else like to share?
Yeah, so I had an example that came to mind around colleagues and students that observe Ramadan. And so in my well-intentioned, you know, I want to be supportive, but failure to kind of calendar that with events. So holding, and you know, in higher ed, we see food as a way to bring students in and kind of build community. But I had a colleague a couple of years ago where I held a retreat with kind of food all day, and it was during Ramadan. And it was through that experience where he said, you know, I'm not going to participate because I'm observing Ramadan and just being around food when I'm already kind of fatigued and tired. And so the next year we changed it where we separated the food into a different room. So if people wanted to kind of have breakfast or snacks, they could go and do that, but not bring it into the main room when we were having our exercises. So, I mean, that was kind of how subtle it happens, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I'd be willing to share an example from the very first time I encountered the concept of implicit bias. So I was taking a class in graduate school with Dr. Kirsten Edwards, who does a lot of fantastic work, and she introduced this idea of implicit bias and had everyone in the class during a class session take an implicit association test. And so I went ahead and took the one that measures essentially the stereotypes that you hold around gender in a male-female binary, and then a binary of work and professionalism and home and family. And so we all ended up having a discussion about the results of our IAT. And the class was something like gender and feminisms in higher education or something, right? So people have opted in because they care about gender justice. They care about gender justice, right? And we were all sharing, and it turned out I was the one person in the class that had the strongest possible implicit association between women and home and men and career. And people were a little bit shocked by that because I am just like the queerest, most gender non-conforming, assigned female at birth person that does a lot of this kind of LGBTQ work and all that jazz. But we were invited to self-reflect, and I actually was not shocked when I took stock of that result, because knowing how implicit associations are formed, it actually makes a lot of sense that would be the association that I have because of my lived experiences. I was raised as part of the Mormon or Latter-day Saint Church, which has very strong traditional ideas around gender roles. Those gender roles were lived out in my household, where my dad was military and often gone for work, and my mother took care of 6 kids and did a wonderful job of raising us in the process. So I don't think I actually met a woman who worked outside of the home until probably middle school. I just didn't have a lot of exposure to that, despite the explicit messaging that my parents gave me that as a girl, that I could still and was expected to actually do just as well as my brothers. I was still expected to chop wood in the backyard and all of these sorts of things. But those intentional counter messages from my very supportive parents have not superseded the years and years of stereotype and association that I've experienced. So now I'm very aware of the fact that I have that bias despite my own identities. And so when I used to help hire resident advisors, I tried to be very conscious of gender dynamics in interviews, who's being asked a follow-up question, who's not being given that opportunity, how we interpret students, the organizations that they're affiliated with in their student activities, and whether the ways in which gender plays into the way we interpret and give value to those sorts of activities.
So you've all brought up different and great examples, and I want to jump ahead to a question we had gauged for later. As I look around colleagues, I have to ask, isn't everyone, including us as student affairs professional, biased in some manner? And how do we go about increasing our awareness for our own bias, and how can that impact our facilitation in practice?
Mm-hmm.
Don't all jump in.
Okay, yes, right. So yes, we are. And we will continue to be, because that is how implicit bias works. But I think the first step of bettering a problem, and notice I didn't say solving, right? Because implicit bias is incredibly pervasive, and you can be conscious of it and you can try to interact it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's ever completely eliminated, right? But the first step of bettering a problem is admitting that we have one, right? And I think there are some wonderful self-assessments that I'm sure we're going to talk about when we talk about implicit bias tests. But they cover implicit, explicit, and structural bias, because I think it was already mentioned by Lena when they said that, it's not just us as individuals, it's the institutions that have been designed by individuals, right, as well. So I know others can speak to that more, but I'll say our policies and our structures reflect our implicit biases, and it's individual and collective.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Anyone else?
Did you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
I will briefly say that I completely agree. We need to be aware of our own biases, because we can't start to address problems that we won't admit affect us personally. It's very easy to point the This happens all the time after implicit bias trainings with folks, where we're very intentional about it being about self-reflection. And many times the commentary afterwards will be pointing out how people have noticed implicit bias in their colleagues. And often it's hard to take that step and explicitly acknowledge this is a problem for me, right? So doing that explicit acknowledgement, but then also moving beyond simply acknowledging privilege or acknowledging biases, and actually taking very concrete steps to mitigate the negative effects of implicit bias. And that can take a number of forms, working to realign our associations so that they actually agree with our explicitly held beliefs and intentions. That can look like being an active bystander and committing to intervening when bias emerges in everyday conversation, and not just with colleagues, but also with our family and with our friends, where we might stand to lose some social status if we confront, hopefully an educational conversation maybe in the moment, but where we actually stand to have to make a sacrifice in order to live out bias busting, if you will. And so that's, I think, really, really important for us to commit to do as professionals. And then also just refusing to get defensive when our own actions are pointed out to us as having been biased. I had an RA one time, some inclusive language work that I had been doing with the RAs. I gave some model language of things they could say. One of those was, "Now, what do you mean when you say that?" In response to one of those, like, "Oh, wow, did they really just say that?" moment. And I said something that was coded language, and this lovely RA said, "Now, Lena, what do you mean when you say that?" And it was a perfect moment for me to reflect on what I had just said and self-correct and take ownership over my action and to want to do better. And that can look like, "Thank you for pointing that out. That was completely inappropriate, and I apologize for the negative impact that had. I am going to commit to doing better next time. Thank you for pointing that out."
Yeah, my thoughts around this are, I'm not sure if all bias is created equal. So I don't know if it's like same and same. And I think that's where kind of context is really important, and also power and privilege, as Lena mentioned. So, and this is where I see the kind of this connection to this tie to racial microaggressions or different types of microaggressions. So kind of everyone can have a bad day, right? We're all going to have bad experiences or might experience poor treatment, but it's the constant daily same thing that I think kind of creates that disparity in some. So if you have more power and you experience bias, it's different than someone who has less power, and this is their daily lived experience around the same set of identities or perceived identities. So like with my staff here, when we were trying to think a lot about good student service, one of the things I say is we should be treating everyone as if they're the president of the college and we know it, right? Because regardless of how we personally feel about our president, we're probably not going to mistreat her or not serve her or be short with her, even if we disagree with her, because of that power dynamic. And that's something I try and use to keep myself in check too, as a senior administrator. When I feel frustrated, when things aren't really going my way, or I call and they can't help me right away, right? That's my own kind of trying to leverage my power. So that, I'm not sure they're all the same because of the frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So I promised viewers that we would spend the latter half of that episode talking about inclusive language. So I'm going to jump around a little bit here and move on. And Yoshiko, ask you if you can help define what a microaggression is and the impact that microaggressions have on the recipient.
Sure. So, and the other speakers can jump in. So, you know, racial microaggressions was first coined by Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s, and Sue and others have really built upon microaggressions research, primarily kind of through counseling and then into education and other arenas. So what Chester Pierce and others defines microaggressions are as this kind of automatic, subtle, it can be overt, covert comments or actions that are often kind of framed as compliments, or usually kind of further denigrate already marginalized groups. So like women or people of color, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, or perceived, right? There's a lot of kind of misidentity in racial microaggressions around race, ethnicity, or we touched on gender pronouns. So if I think a little bit about my early experiences, a classic microaggression that I heard that I didn't know was a microaggression was, "You're pretty for a Black girl." So framed as a compliment. Or I was told a lot, I didn't know that there are actually two types of Black people until somebody told me, right? The acceptable and the unacceptable. And the way it was framed was, right, there's, you know, N-word and there's Black people, and you're lucky that you fall into the Black people category. And at the time I thought, oh yeah, I am lucky. I mean, I'm not like those other people. So that's kind of the broad strokes for racial microaggressions. And there's two really key points around the impacts to the people who experience microaggressions. And one is accumulation is key. And I kind of touched on that a little bit. And the other is it's really focused on the perception of the person, not the intent of the perpetrator. So my mom is white, and when we go out shopping, we always do this little test where no one ever thinks we're together. So I let her go first to pay for her items. She pays with a credit card, moves on. I come and pay for my items. I would say 75% of the time I'm asked for ID, right? So same interaction, no policy written. So, and you can't rule it out. So what's the difference that makes the difference? A white woman just stepped up and did the same transaction that I did. So that is kind of the piece around racial microaggressions. And then there are other, you know, types of racial microaggressions, and then the intersectionality around microaggressions. So I don't know if other people want to jump in.
Well, Zaneta, I know you've helped here at Rutgers develop a microaggressions workshop. And also a website to encourage Rutgers students to use more inclusive language. Can you share a little bit about that, how that program came about and the impact that you've observed?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our office back in 2014, actually, We adopted this inclusive language poster that came out of University of Maryland. So I want to give them credit for the poster. This was a really great poster, and it was coming from students finding Dr. Seuss language and finding language to sort of name their experiences that they might not have had a name for before. But it included things like common phrases like "that's so gay" or "that's so ghetto," or using "retarded" as descriptors of people, items, and behaviors, which those three examples negate and trivialize the experiences of folks in the queer community, those who were raised in poverty, and those with developmental disabilities, respectively. And building up from that poster, our center designed an interactive, online, educational, mixed media. It's a lot of descriptors, but essentially it's an online module, right, that takes current media and mixed media, right, so not just video, and it sort of creates like a journey for folks to address some of the common microaggressions that happen on college campuses. And we accompanied that with a facilitation guide so that we could actually teach undergraduate students to teach this to other undergraduate students, in addition to doing some professional development with faculty and staff. And it's very basic. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about what we should be doing to sort of sustain that. And I think Language Matters is a very good introduction, basic entry point into taking a moment to think, I've done that. I've said those things. And I never knew it. Or I've experienced that. I've heard people say those things. It made me feel terrible. I didn't know there was a name for it, or that other people experienced it too. And so I think it's designed to really challenge participants to think about the impact of their behaviors, right? As opposed to the intentions. And it gives them a choice, right? It gives them a choice to either perpetuate those negative behaviors or to interrupt them, or, interrupt them within themselves and within others. And, it's especially in some of the assessment after New Student Orientation. I should clarify, we've done this at New Student Orientation now for 3 years. So we've reached about 20,000 students alone just in that portion. And, some of the assessment from New Student Orientation, students have claimed that to be like their favorite part of orientation, right? And so I think it says something when you have students saying like, thank you, right? And of course, it's a mixed bag, right? I think some folks, particularly, I think microaggressions and implicit bias are big steps for little feet sometimes for first-year students. And it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to have your stereotypes that are so deeply ingrained, whether consciously or unconsciously, challenged, especially when intentions are good, right? That's particularly the challenge for first years, and for anyone really, actually. But, I think ultimately, if you really want to unpack implicit bias and work on it, it has to be a sustained dialogue, sustained engagement. So I don't want to go too much into that. I know other folks are going to talk about that, but it's a great first step. And, I'm excited to see where it goes from here.
And I know we'll share resources later, but I do want to share that on the episode website. Lena has shared some great links to PDFs, including a great one on inclusive language. So please, everyone, feel free to check that out, download it, and use it. So I want to put something out there, and Lena, maybe you can start us off in this conversation. In 2008, Boyson and Vogel conducted a study that attempted to measure the effects of formal multicultural training in combating bias and stereotypes attributed to African Americans, lesbians, and gay men. And although explicit bias declined significantly with this formal training, implicit bias toward these groups remained unchanged. And in fact, most studies show that formal education and training do little to change implicit attitudes. So my question is, what should we be doing instead? What's the alternative?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that study actually speaks to the nature of implicit bias itself, that one-time training cannot possibly realign the implicit associations that we've learned over a lifetime. So a lot of the time at the Kirwan Institute, we uplift strategies to address and to mitigate the effects of implicit bias. Only one small focus of that is how we can actually use the malleability of our brains to change our associations, because there has been some success in doing that. That's research supported, doing things like sustained, sorry, losing my terminology, essentially sustained focus on using mindfulness meditation to create empathy for groups of which we are not a part that we might hold a negative association with. So there's actually some promising literature in the way that mindfulness meditation can help us realign our biases to be more closely related to those explicitly held beliefs and intentions that we have. Personally, I think that while that could be really helpful, I think it could be perhaps smarter and more strategic to be focusing on, okay, if I know I have an implicit bias that does not align with how I think of myself as a good person and that does not align with my beliefs around equity, what do I do to make sure that that implicit bias I've learned over a lifetime does not then influence my actions in ways that negatively affect the people around me who have that identity? So a lot of it is awareness and intentionality in our actions. A lot of that is around identifying key decision-making moments, those moments where it's really important to get that decision right, and strategizing how we can reduce the conditions that make us susceptible to implicit bias. Those conditions being if there's time pressure, if we have compromised cognitive load, which essentially just means things like if we're tired, if the decision is really important, and or if we're distracted. And then things like overconfidence and objectivity, because we know from rebound effect, if we're absolutely certain we can never possibly make a biased decision, then we're more likely to end up relying on our implicit biases. So being aware of those dynamics and mitigating them. When we're hiring someone new to our department, being aware, making sure that we give our committee more than enough time to make that decision so that we can talk with one another around what words like fit mean, and decode that kind of language that's very common in higher education. And then actually have these conversations explicitly with one another with the understanding that we are expecting to hold each other accountable when bias does emerge. But the most important thing we can do is be proactive in the ways that we reflect ourselves to make sure that the implicit biases we hold are not negatively affecting the people around us through our decision making. So all of that is a long version of saying research is kind of still out on the effectiveness of changing our implicit associations because it is really difficult, but it's very clear that we can take proactive steps individually and as departments, colleges, et cetera, to address the effects of implicit bias and to prevent bias from emerging in the first place. And then doing not just reconciliation, but actually reparation and whatever else we need to do when those biases emerge and have really unfortunate consequences for our students, for our colleagues, et cetera.
Yoshiko, Zaneta, any other strategies beyond the traditional workshop?
Yeah, so I think that's where, so if I think of it from kind of my perspective, that's where the policy procedures piece really has to come in and reinforce if it's professional development or training. So I think where colleges kind of fall off is that we do what my former mentor used to call kind of the food, fun, and famous people approach to diversity and equity, or heroes and holidays, right, if some people talked about. And it's easy to stay on that surface level, then kind of really go into how our policies are inequitable, and therefore they also support inequitable outcomes. And I think that's where implicit bias is a challenge, because, and I'll speak from my experience as a CDO at a previous college, there were many times through the bias process, because I led the bias team, where students or faculty would come and they had evidence, and I would think, yeah, they have been discriminated based on their disability or race. And they have a very strong case. And so I would put it forth through HR or further investigation. And they all came back, no findings, because what the standard they were looking for was that overt, explicit, someone said in a screening committee, well, I don't want to hire someone who is Asian. So that would have, so the policy actually didn't meet what people were talking about in my experience. So I think that's a piece. So we should always be doing kind of the awareness building and the ongoing stuff, but we have to have that policy and practice there. Or I think we'll just kind of end up with just not a lot of progress. I also think that so we do a lot around faculty hiring and thinking about how can we diversify our faculty to more closely mirror our student population. And, we've really had limited success. So kind of incremental change. And one of the problems is, like, what is the incentive for people to do it differently, and what is the consequence if they don't? And we've tried to, at a previous college, I thought we were being very intentional. We negotiated it so it was in the faculty contract. It was part of the tenure and promotion process. We had kind of the search advocacy model. I reviewed all screening committee, all files, and then made recommendations to other VPs. And the first year we had kind of a blip, and we had a more diverse kind of faculty cohort coming in. The second year it kind of leveled out. And after 3 years, we were doing some analysis. And one of the things we found that if we kept at that same pace, it would be 50 years before our faculty more closely mirrored our student population. And that was if our student population stayed the same. So, I mean, it feels kind of a glacial pace. And that just speaking from my community and technical college system. So what we have are going to be mostly white people, if we're talking about race, teaching mostly students of color. And then, So how are we going to address that?
All right, I'll skip you on this one, Zaneta. We probably have time. We've covered a lot of ground. We probably have time for one question before we get to closing resources. And I want to combine two thoughts. We got a question from Twitter from John Slaughter from Niagara University. And they ask, how do you commit to being an active bystander and addressing implicit bias on the spot as a professional? Now, we know that a lot of these conversations related to bias, as you've all pointed out, now happen in often this faceless and counter-free environment of the internet, where in the past they might have happened in a dining hall, in a lounge, in a club meeting. Do we have a responsibility as student affairs professionals to monitor? And how does bystander intervention work in an online space? Anyone want to jump on that?
You probably need another higher ed live session to talk about that fully. I mean, I think there are some things, right? So often what comes out online is not implicit, right? It is explicit. And so I think having a bias reporting system on campus that includes the ability to upload things like screenshots for students if they want to take that step after experiencing something online is really important. Being proactive and giving students and all of our peers too, not just our students, tools to have difficult conversations, both in person and online. And I think, Lena, you mentioned the question of what do you mean by that? That's actually one of the most common phrases that I think have actually really helped me to help folks really reflect on their own behaviors and to have a further conversation that sort of lets guards down, right? And then, helps us move further along instead of don't do that. Although, some days you got to say, don't do that, right? There's no judgment there. But I think if you're able to have an educational moment, I think what do you mean by that is a really great question. And you can ask that both online and in person. But ultimately, if things are so sort of raised, right, and obvious and explicit, and they're online, like to have students, to give students avenues to actually be able to, get a response. And to have that behavior addressed, especially if it's not anonymous, is so important. So I think a bias response form, including a bias response team, is something that's important. And it's an intervention in some ways. The other intervention is actually checking in with the person, like if it's not you. An intervention is checking in with the person it was directed towards. And that's something that doesn't necessarily escalate the situation, but it provides care and support for your peers. And you could do that online or in person as well.
So from a work context, so people would say, oh, the way you were treated in that meeting, they would say it after the meeting, not in the meeting. So one of the things I would say would be really helpful to me if you would say that in that space instead of, coming to me afterwards to say, oh, that was so horrible. I've had kind of white male colleagues say, how can I be an ally to you? And I kind of never really had an answer. And then I started to get really specific. And I think that's one of the things we can do. So I would say, okay, well, you can support me when you see I'm interrupted in a meeting, if you say, oh, Yoshiko was just interrupted, can we circle back to that? That's allyship, And so I think if we can think of specific ways that we can be supported when people offer support, or they want to interrupt bias or racism or hate speech. So I think this is where we run into kind of free speech and hate speech. And I see this on my campus because people have the right to their personal opinion, but then what happens when they make that public? And in my campus, it's like that's hate speech. Well, from when I talk to my AAG, he says, oh, actually, that's actually free speech, right? So how do we sit in that tension and still make people feel, and still have an inclusive and welcoming campus? Can be very difficult.
To that point, when I am speaking with folks who raise the whole free speech, right. Which let me just say, there actually is some research evidence that invoking free speech in response to racist speech is most often done by people who hold explicitly and implicitly racist attitudes. So let's not lose that in the conversation. And at the same time, a lot of the time framing that can help is saying, well, so maybe our question should be less about, do I have the right to say this? And more focused on the question of, is this the right thing for me to say? And flipping that script away from the legal context of whether that speaker can come to campus or not, and instead talking about what type of campus community do we want to be creating here and what steps do we need to take in order to achieve that, can be really helpful. And so speaking to the idea of being a bystander who intervenes, part of that is being able to identify when bias emerges, which we can't do if we're not constantly educating ourselves on terminology, on the experiences of our students who have marginalized identities. And we need that level of awareness to be able to know when to intervene, because we can't do that if we are ignorant in the true sense of what some of those dynamics are. So I think of this as doing our own work, as many people have said that white people need to do. We need to do our own work, educate ourselves, stop relying on people of color to take time out of their day to educate white folks about what it's like to be them, and to tell oppressors, hey, you should probably stop oppression, and here's why. But having those conversations with our colleagues, whether it's in affinity spaces or whatever it is, and shouldering that burden so that we're leveraging our privilege instead of just acknowledging it, checking off that box, and then thinking we're a really good person, so that's all we have to do.
That's a great thought to end on. I do want to ask each of you to take less than 30 seconds so we can finish close on time here, to share a few resources, websites, books, conferences, newsletters, associations, that you think will help the audience continue to learn and explore some of the topics that we've covered today during the show. Zaneta, you want to start us off?
Sure, 30 seconds. I think MTV's Look Different interactive web platform is really great, which includes the Decoded series by Francesca Ramsey. But ultimately, have an honest conversation with yourself and your colleagues about the conversations you haven't been having or you've been skirting around. And I think conduct a campus climate study, listen to your students, right? And for please goodness sakes, do something with that campus climate study when you get your results, even if the results are hard. Our work is not excellent unless it's inclusive. And I think it takes work, it takes time, and it starts with us, right? Our campuses change when we change. So, I hope that you all are dedicated to this and you reach out for resources when you realize you've hit a spot where you don't know where to go next.
Great. Yoshiko?
So a book that I really shaped kind of my thinking is Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. I would say that would be a great text to start with, or even I refer to it all the time. It was a powerful resource for me.
Great. Lena?
Certainly. So one resource that gets updated is the Kirwan Institute's website. We have a section specifically on implicit bias, and that houses research reports that relate to everything from K-12 education to criminal justice. It also houses every edition of the State of the Science Implicit Bias Review, which is something that the Kirwan Institute has done for 5 years now. The 2017 edition is forthcoming, and I'll be a co-author on that. It's essentially a literature review that is accessible of all of the most relevant literature on implicit bias that has recently come out. And then I'll direct people to the Higher Ed Live website, where Tony has kindly posted some resources that I sent. I'll highlight my favorite one, which is Being an Active Bystander, in which there is actual not only strategy, such as using humor, but model language of what you can say. For example, when someone says, "What are you?" you can respond with something like, "Human, how about you?" So you can take a look at those tools, just add them to your toolbox, and in that moment decide which tool do I want to pick up to respond to this situation.
Great. And again, I really appreciate it. And we'll put all those resources up on the episode so people can share them and refer to them later. Thank you to everyone. I know we only got to about half the questions that we had slated today, so perhaps you're right, Zaneta. Perhaps we need another episode to cover this topic. Certainly by the size of the live audience, this is a topic of great interest to many folks in the profession. So again, thank you for your time. I will be back in 2 weeks to talk about organizational change and planning, and Heather Shea will be back on October 4th to discuss master's preparation programs. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com. It's a great resource. Or you can also subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Doody. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thank you.